Happy New Year! Back in December, there was this idea creeping around in my head, and even telling myself that tutorials don't do that well didn't help. Because let's be real, most of my videos didn't do that well. So, sewing tutorial it is. As some of you may know, I am not the most willing to show me sewing on camera. Most of the time you see only little snippets of how the doll clothes are constructed. I want to fix that with this series of videos. What I have in mind is an in-depth look at different kind of clothing and to show you every step from making the pattern to the finishing touches. Each video is going to focus on a specific group of clothing, how to make the pattern and how to alter it for different results. I'm using 3 different dolls: Frankie from Monster High, a curvy Made to Move Barbie, and a Sutton, I think, from my scene. I try to cover 3 different fits for each item. But let us start with why I think I am able to give advice on sewing. So every troll who is watching this, you may want to skip this part, or I may be able to convince you that I have at least a basic idea of it. So, story time. When I was a little one, around 9 or 10 I think, I started sewing for my Barbies. It never ended that well, but I already tried to copy patterns from t-shirts. So I had a kind of basic idea how to help myself, or how to use the work of someone else to my advantage. After my parents separated, my brother and I stayed with our dad, and though I was the only one who had ever used a sewing machine, it became my task to mend and rehem my brother's pants. 2 years later, when I was 16, I moved to my mom, and there the whole shenanigans started. I made myself some medieval clothes because once a year I visited the medieval fair daily for the 3 weeks it stayed in Bremen, and I tried my first more form-fitting clothes for a friend. Through drawing I noticed that you can split the body into shapes, and that led to an idea how to measure for a pattern. Years later, I noticed while shopping with a friend for a fancy dress she needed for what occasion ever, I can't remember, that most of the seams were quite close to the ones I made. Basically, I had made princess seams. Yay! Isn't it kind of funny how I refused to even look at patterns so far? Why make it easier for you? Of course that changed and I really wanted to become costume designer at a theater. Never happened, but I started sewing more and more complex stuff. Still refusing to use pre-made patterns. Today my hatred for patterns isn't as violent as it was back then, but I still prefer to make my own ones. And I think I learned quite some stuff since then. I would not be able to compete with someone who is trained in it, but I do think that I have at least some knowledge. That means everything I talk about in these videos is based on my own experience. I still hope it will help someone. So, enough of this. Let's talk about some basics. It may not be that obvious right away, but there are some major differences between sewing for a human and sewing for a doll. I did all of these when I started, and with each of these points, it was like, gosh, why didn't I think about that? So it may feel for you like this as well, or you are just much smarter than I am. The first thing I want to talk about for a moment is the choice of fabric. I prefer to use thinner fabrics to reduce the added bulk that comes with the seams and hems. Using a thicker fabric can make the finished piece look more clumsy and not as fitting, which is a problem especially with the more tight-fitting garments. When you want to make something that is a little bit more baggy or something like that, you can get away with thicker material. But if you want to make a corset or something like that, I would recommend thinner fabrics to make it look more, like the life-sized counterpart. Second thing, drape of fabric. Something I didn't take into account at first is that lightweight fabric may drape well when used on a human, because obviously more material, more gravity, or the gravity has more potential. But when you scale it down, it doesn't work as well. So sometimes it makes sense to weigh down the hem with some curtain weights, for example. Just all of this is to aim for the most possible accurate representation of real garments. Of course, there will always be some stuff happening when you sew in such a tiny scale. For example, skirts where you mainly see the problem with the hem. A circle skirt in a life size for a woman of normal proportions would drape quite nice, lay itself into its folds, and the gravity would do its thing. On a doll, it can lead to the skirt fraying out or staying out quite a lot. So that is why sometimes you may want to add some weight to it. And the best thing I found so far are these curtain weights. It's a kind of ribbon with some weights in it. And if you stitch that to the inside of the dress as lightly as possible, it helps quite nicely. So, next thing, patterns. When sewing for a human, you are able to make a lot more seams than for a doll. For a normal corset or corset-like top, I would use at least 8 pieces, but doing that for a doll gives you quite a lot of extra fabric on the inside that you have to deal with. So if you can skip some of the seams, it would be wise to do that. I prefer to use only 3 pieces with darts in the front. If you feel that it does not look corset-like enough or corset-like enough, you can always use some top stitching or added decorations to give the illusion of seams being there. let's face it, most of the doll clothing stuff is giving the illusion of something. Same goes with factory-made doll clothes. A lot of them are stitched together, so you have all the layers, the garments that would normally be separated, stitched into one. And that is something I do quite often as well. For example, if I have a corset and a blouse that is under it, I will cut away every excess of the blouse and stitch it onto the top of the corset after everything is finished, so that you reduce the bulk that is underneath. Because every layer that will come or that will be added will distract from the basic form or shape of the doll. And I know at least Barbies, and I think Monster High as well, are made with that in mind. That is why Barbie, for example, has this rather long neck, or had this rather long neck. I think the newer ones are a little bit less strange. But the original Barbie was proportioned like she was to take in account that as soon as you add a skirt or something, as soon as you add clothing, this will show, and that will alter the body shape. And in line with this, there is another thing I would completely do on a human scale, but not on a doll. Lining. Staying with our corset-like top as our example, I would line a normal one by sewing the same thing again out of a thinner fabric and stitch them together. Doing so on a 1:6 scale gives you at least 4 layers of fabric on some points. And when turned, all of that is laying in between the layers as well. So even with some top stitching, you end up with something that I would not call tight-fitting. It may be controversial because the inside looks like a mess, but I tend to just zigzag stitch the raw edges and fold them in once. What leads to hemming. A hem that is turned over twice will give you more bulk. And in skirts, for example, you get more stiffness. So the whole gravity thing works even less. I really prefer to turn them over only once. If you are bothered by the messy insides, especially in a skirt where you may see it, you can attach a ribbon on the edge of the fabric and stitch that to the inside. Basically, the zigzag stitched raw edge will be covered with a ribbon, and when you turn it, you stitch the ribbon to the other fabric. That encases the raw edge and makes it less visible. Just an option. Also for the hemming. The order of things. You can't reach inside a 1:6 scale sleeve that easy. Even with hand sewing. We don't need to talk about machine sewing. So in this case, it is far easier to finish the hems as long as the garment is still able to be laid out flat. And then close the last seams. You end up with this last one being more visible, but with some hand stitching, you can hide them rather well. When I started making more and more doll stuff, I first refused to sew by hand. Now I do a combination of machine and hand sewing, which really helped. And sometimes you may want to think about splitting some seams and not doing them in one row. Again, sewing for a human-sized person. Human-sized person. You know what I mean. I would close the princess seam in one go. On a doll, this is only 4 or 5 stitches when you have a lot of doll. So I tend to stitch down to the center of the breast and then pin the rest of the fabric and stitch the rest down. With these 2 points, you should keep in mind, of course, that the center of the breast shouldn't be as pointy because looks funny. But yeah, splitting the seams may help. And one last thing. To not confuse pattern pieces. For example, you are sewing pants. And the back and the front looks rather similar, especially scaled down. You can always take a piece of thread and just stitch it in an up and down motion on top, just into the seam allowance, so that you can mark, okay, this is the back side. Another thing, just clip a little triangle piece into the seam allowance. That is something you can do to not confuse the pattern pieces, which happens quite a lot. And with this, the first video is done. Everything you saw before was scripted. Not everything, some parts were improvised, but most of it was scripted. First time for me, don't know if I like it. The second episode of this series will focus on pants, and I hope it will go live or online next week. We will see about that. And one last thing, I'm not planning to do just sewing tutorials for the next few weeks. I'm planning to do some dolls in between. So the whole sewing experience or sewing tutorial tips, advices, whatever, will get a break from time to time. Because these videos are a different kind of work, not as creative, and I do need some creative stuff to get going. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this and it was useful for you in some way. If you are sewing yourself, maybe leave your experience in the comments down below. Maybe you have even better tips than I have. These are just things that I noticed in my sewing journey. So I'm not claiming that they are good for everyone or that my tips are the ones that are the best. They are not. Clearly not. But yeah, maybe it will help, and I would love for this to be a place where we can talk about different experience and how you do things. And if I find something, or if you write something down in the comments that I think is genius, I'm totally happy to add it to another video. if you are fine with it. Even if you have critique or things that you think I could improve, tell me. Of course, in a nice way. Everyone has other experiences and stuff that works for you. So why not talk about it and maybe help someone with it? So I hope you have a nice time, and we will see us in another video. Bye.